the epicenter of everything cool, CrossFit, fitness, nutrition, TV, movies, wrestling. Today, I'm very, very fortunate to have Eddie Fossler, who is the creator and founder of the Podcast Arcade, in which Geek Vice, which John and Aaron are the hosts for, and where my podcast sits under. Today, Eddie is joining us. Thank you, Eddie Fossler.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome.
No, this is great. And today, Eddie's going to talk with us about how he formed the Podcast Arcade, all the different shows that are under Podcast Arcade, what's coming to the Podcast Arcade, and then also things like if you're interested in podcasting, how you get started, what he's passionate about with podcasting. And then we're going to talk a little bit, of course, about his fitness regimen, because we can't go an episode without fitness. So welcome, Eddie. Thank you for being on today, and take it away.
Oh my gosh, with an intro like that.
It's all well-desered. All very well-deserved.
Let's wrap the show now. We peaked.
Nope. I've got you for at least 30 minutes.
So thank you for having me again. This is exciting.
It's a pleasure. It's a total pleasure.
I started, it feels so weird. The Podcast Arcade, and this is kind of its heart lies in being kind of a like-minded group. I mean, I think you can't have a rudderless ship. So I hesitate to but you do sometimes have.
You are the captain.
You have to direct things a little bit from time to time, but for the most part, it's done by the words escape me at the moment. It's done by consensus. You want to get as many people on board with something as much as possible. But a few years ago, well, actually, it was a couple of years ago, the idea came to me, and it was another year before we pulled the trigger. But me having been a part of the Doug and Eddie show originally, and then also meeting John, and then finding out he had a podcast, Geek Bites, and then also meeting other people who were creating podcasts, and they were all unique and different and fun. And as you meet people who do these things, podcasts and start to stand out to you, like, oh, I really like what they're doing, and I kind of want to either do something with them or start co-creating something. So what came to me was the idea of creating more or less a network, a club kind of podcasts. And so we developed the Podcast Arcade kind of formula, for lack of a better word, and started inviting people, just extending invitations to podcasts that we either admired or respected what they were doing or were entertained by it. And that was my big thing, was don't invite somebody whose show you don't, certainly. And so initially, we started off with the Podcast Arcade, and my podcast, Daydream Instruction Manual, was the first one in that group. And then Falcon Punch Thunder Dads is the nerdy fitness podcast. I guess I should describe what Daydream is. It's more
I'm curious. I'd love to know what Daydream Instruction Manual, like what the impetus for the name, and then what it's like, what your goal in creating it was.
Daydream Instruction Manual is probably one of those, like, all of the podcasts that I make, I love on some level. They're kind of like my kids.
That's good.
With Daydream Instruction Manual, that is like where I dump a lot of my energy into that one. It's hard to describe to people what it is, as much as like it's a comedy variety show. Although that is kind of the inspiration of what it is. It's kind of a nerd comedy variety show. But the idea behind it was, I like to invoke feeling stuff more than I can actually invoke maybe sometimes actual tangible words. And so as far as Daydream goes, and with me, I was like, most of us in this group either are kids or were kids of the 80s, some of us 70s, just and in that era especially, we were used to the notion of being out with our friends on bikes and being told to be home at a certain time. And so that feeling that kind of is invoked when you're riding your bike back to your house and it's dusk and the sun is setting and it's summertime and there's that weird pensive feeling of like it's summer, so you have all this free time, but you got to get home, but you're having a fun time. There's a lot of emotions in that moment, and so
Yes.
for me, I wanted to capture that in a show essentially, and so with that, Daydream Instruction Manual honestly is a fun without any sort of like, we don't like doing review. I mean, we will share our thoughts on something, but we don't like reviewing things. The idea is it's a show where people can visit, listen, engage about anything and everything that's kind of quote unquote nerdy. I try to avoid that word a bunch. But in the same token, it's also a space of positive, happy reinforcement. It's just a good place. That's kind of the idea behind Daydream Instruction Manual.
I like it.
That's a long-winded answer.
But I think you captured the essence of that feeling. And having grown up in that same time period, and John and I sort of captured a moment like that yesterday. We came out of a restaurant and there were hot air balloons. And I grew up in Lenexa, Kansas, and seeing hot air balloons in the summer was a staple. And there would be that end of the day, like you talked about, like riding back from the community pool and knowing that, there was only a certain amount of daylight left. And there's a wistfulness, I think, in that kind of like a more innocent time when we were kids and we didn't have all this other stuff going on, the weight of the world and everything. And so I appreciate that. I really do. And that you're able to capture it and have a place for people to be part of a community that feel comfortable and can talk about things like that. And like you said, all things nerdy. Who doesn't want to talk about all things nerdy? I do. So
exactly. You captured it right there. Seeing hot air balloons on a summer's evening. I mean, that's exactly the feel that I want to invoke with that show.
And I think you've captured it. And I do have something to show you. I'm nervous. While I was on Geek Vice the other night, I had the opportunity to color.
I don't know.
Yes.
I'm taking a screenshot of that right now.
Yes. And then I've just started on this one, just the legs of the robot.
Oh.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to let you know that as a kid who loves to color, you have inspired me in many ways. So I know how much I appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit about the other podcasts that are part of the podcast arcade.
Yeah, those are a little more easy to sum up. So Falcon Punch Thunder Dads is the like health and fitness podcast with a nerdy slant.
I am a fan.
Yeah, it's fun. Thank you. It's a fun show. So we just combine, our love of staying active and being active with also our love of things kind of, nerdy. Once again, that word keeps coming up.
But that's a good thing. And your co-host is Justin
Tallman. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I should backpedal quick and say the co-hosts on Daydream are myself, Bart, who just kind of rejoined us, Mike, and Billy. In no particular order there, just as I was rattling them off. And each one of those guys brings this like magic to the show. It's one of those things that like if a thing is more than the sum of its parts, it's like getting all four of us together is exciting. So I'm excited to kind of get back to that. But anyway, Falcon Punch. Justin and I discussed. Justin has really gone off the deep end. He is doing an adventure race almost every weekend now, and is a very active guy. He is not about holding still.
No, he's not. He's in constant movement, and he's super healthy and fit and active. I wish I had a third of his energy. I can't even imagine what I could accomplish.
He never stops.
Nope.
And he's a great coach too, and he loves podcasting and loves the podcast as well. And I you know, still have a passion for this stuff. I've been royally derailed by getting my house together to sell and then move, and so there's my excuse for that. But still have that active lifestyle as part of our normal daily routine. And then the next show down the line invited to the network was Geek Vice, and that's with the lovely Aaron and John, and they were the first outside of my creation podcast that we reached out to. It was almost synonymous. It was Geek Vice, and then right after, I mean, within an hour, I think I reached out to Underground Inc. as well. But Geek Vice is kind of your a little bit of a variety show too. It seems like where the guys discuss movies, a lot of board games, and then they have kind of a gaming arm through Aaron's Geek Vice Gaming. And I love the board game angle with Geek Vice. It's very cool. And John is like a savant with that.
He is. In a lot of ways, he's like a 14-year-old kid who never lost his passion for board gaming. And so it's something he totally loves and is so knowledgeable about. We'll talk probably once a day about something that might be on his radar. And it's definitely something I know he loves to do. And so I try to encourage and be there for him whenever he calls and says, oh yeah, I had this game on my radar and I just happened to be at the game shop and we bought it and played it. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, and they cover a variety of interesting things. I agree. Like they cover movies and TV shows, and the only thing they're missing is wrestling. But I'll be talking to Billy about that, so no worries there.
That's where you fill in that spot right there.
Yes, indeed.
And then shortly thereafter, like I said, within an hour, we extended an invitation to Underground Inc. as well, and they accepted. Thank goodness. And that is hosted by Billy, Ben, and Anthony, and those guys do kind of a Mystery Science Theater 3000 thing where they don't necessarily roast the movie, but they comment throughout the course of an entire film, and they drop little tidbits and knowledge and trivia and things that they thought about. It's kind of a fun listen, really. It's a cool show, and they tend to invite me on whenever it's a space themed movie, so that's always kind of a fun.
Well, those guys are cool anyway. I mean, I think
they're just fun.
I've met everyone but Bart, which is understandable. And I have to say, it's just a great group of people, period.
You didn't meet Ben, unfortunately, either.
Okay, I didn't meet Ben. Yeah. But everybody else, super likable, super genuine, just great human beings. I mean, obviously wonderful podcasters, but at the root of it, very good people that I enjoy talking with.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. The last podcast we invited to be part of the show, who are part of the network now, is a podcast called Goad Kicker. That's GOAD Kicker, and that's hosted by Carl Smith, and he is a writer / podcaster, and he's a published author, and it's more of a nerd philosophy kind of show.
Okay.
And he kind of has a person, he questions a thing and has you kind of dig deeper on top of a thing and, you know, look into its meaning a little bit more, and super lucky to have him part of the network as well. And then more recently, I've launched another podcast called Make Eternia Great Again, and that's a He-Man themed podcast.
I love it.
And you'd think to yourself, how much can two people talk about He-Man? But we do a pretty good job.
Well, there's so much to talk about by the power of Grayskull. So I imagine it's chock full of, you know, all kinds of fascinating tidbits and references. I think I saw somewhere that they're making a He-Man movie, which I'm sure you guys have already covered and everything.
They are indeed, and we have. And we'll probably talk about it some more between now and it being in theaters, I'm sure. So, but there's that one. It's totally a fun show. If you like He-Man, check it out. But if you don't, you don't have to.
Did you guys cover that show? I can't remember. I think it was on like the FX channel, but it was kind of like a He-Man, like Son of Zorn. Yes. Did you guys cover that as well?
We've not, and we've discussed things like that because we thought about, with a show as topic, it's different for me because most of the shows I do tend to be kind of variety themed. And
Right.
with this one, it's like a laser focus on He-Man. And so we talked about getting outside of that a little bit. And I'm not sure we'll ever actually discuss anything like seriously outside. We may reference it, but we may not break it apart,
Gotcha.
We're trying to stay on track on this one.
Is there anyone who is like in the Skeletor camp, like he's just misunderstood, he's just a good dude trying to keep his castle, or is it all like, He-Man's the dude, he's got this tiger, he's got the girl?
Oh, there's definitely some villain apologists out there for sure. We've had those kinds of discussions where it's like, maybe a merman's just trying to be merman. You know what I'm saying? You don't need to stop be mean about it.
Right.
And then we are looking at launching a new show fairly soon. I want to kind of keep some of those details under wraps, but it'll be launching in the next probably about a week or so, I imagine. And we'll be posting some updates as that starts to happen.
Can you tell us the name of this new secretive podcast?
The name might give away the subject, but I will on this podcast. I'll go ahead and drop the name just to kind of give it out there. We're calling it Paranormal Dads.
Paranormal Dads. I have a suspicion it's going to have something to do with things like Bigfoot, UFOs, aliens, goblins, ghouls, ghosties, all that good stuff that John is very interested in as well. So
that's kind of the idea. Is we're gonna launch the show itself, and then get several episodes under our belt, and then once that happens, we'll start kind of reaching out to other Podcast Arcade hosts and having them guest spot, and we'll pick a topic that they want to discuss and just tear it apart. So.
Well, John is practically an expert on unexplained alien files and Area 51. So for future reference, if you need someone to talk about orbs or, infrared readings or, things like that, he's your guy. If there's a Bigfoot show on, or the Yeti, its Native American cousin, the Sasquatch, otherwise known as the Squatch, he's your fella. He loves that stuff.
I think we need to John.
yeah, probably need a series just with John on his love of Squatch, but we digress. So we're excited, and we'll be looking forward to hearing more about that, Paranormal Dads. So who will be hosting with you on that, or will it just be you?
No, Paranormal Dads. We're introducing some new people to this. So even with the Make Eternia Great Again podcast, that is still two people. That's myself and Carl. So two guys who already have shows on the network. We just decided to do a different show. This is actually featuring two newcomers to the Podcast Arcade. Actually, I should rephrase that. One newcomer. One is actually a guy that I've nicknamed the Architect.
No.
He is the guy who has built and hosts, who's kindly built and hosts our Podcast Arcade webpage. Name is Pat Pleiss, and he has been kind of the man behind the curtain for the Podcast Arcade. And then our good friend Andy Myers is going to be on the third man on that podcast as the third official host.
Okay.
And he is a psychic medium here in Omaha.
Really?
Yeah, no, that's how he pays his bills.
I want to meet this dude.
And he's a cool cat, and we went on that Bigfoot hunt last year.
Yeah, we didn't get to hear too much about that. I'm very eager to hear more about that.
It's fun, and we can share a certain amount of detail with that. We got to be careful. We did sign a non-disclosure agreement, so we got to tread lightly on that one. But yeah, the three of us had such a great time doing it. We started spitballing different ideas after the fact, and once again, it comes back down to podcasting with me. And I was like, you know what we could do? We could do a podcast.
How did you get into podcasting, if I can ask?
It's kind of a fun story. So it all comes down to a video game I played about 10 years ago called Braid.
Okay.
And if you've never played, if anyone out there likes games, and it's a very simple, it's not a complicated 3D, it's a side-scrolling game just like Mario Brothers. It's as complicated as Mario Brothers. But it was done by this guy, this game developer named Jonathan Blow. And he is well known in the gaming world as creating what you would call art games.
Okay.
And the game within itself is a game, but as you play it, you begin to experience either an emotion or thoughts. The game basically encourages you to get more out of the game than just playing it. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And so I played this game. It was a riveting game. It was very existential and cool, and it's very weird to say that in the genre of Mario Brothers, but it was. And when I finished it, I decided to follow him online. And I wasn't a big Reddit guy or Twitter yet. And this is about 10 years ago. So it really hadn't quite, Facebook really wasn't a thing yet, or it was starting. But I found him on some chat boards and was just following him. And then he had two friends that started a podcast. And so just because I was at work and bored, I downloaded their podcast and started listening to it. And it was called oh my gosh, I'm going to die now. It's called the Jeff and Casey Show.
Okay.
And it was just two guys. One was a software developer, and another one was basically a video game engine creator. And their show was hilarious. These are just two guys who just worked normal day jobs and decided to hang out at work for an hour or two at the end of one of their work days and record a podcast. And it was raw, not raw like dirty. I mean, they did swear quite a bit, but it was more like you just got a really clear sense of who these people were within a few episodes, between their senses of humor, observations they'd make. And I enjoyed just listening to the show. And, I think you can consume so much of something before at some point you decide you want to maybe start making it yourself.
Yes.
That's not for everybody. I get that. And, but for me, I've always kind of had a creative mindset anyway. I've always wanted to I was in community theater. I, loved helping direct and I did technical stuff behind scenes. I was actually, not the star, but on the main list of actors on a couple of plays. And I enjoyed every bit of it all the time. It was never stressful. It never caused me anything but joy. And so as I got older and, you have kids and obligations and things that eat up a lot of your time, the reality of doing something creative gets a little bit harder to do. And as I was consuming this medium of podcasts, I began to kind of have that little thing in my brain saying, well, maybe you should make one, And it sat there for years. I'm not going to lie. Like I listened to these. This was about 10 years ago. Maybe like 8 years ago. I started listening to their show, and I'd say it took another 3.5 years before I actually did it. And you whenever you decide to do anything, whether it's podcast, do a short film, record a song, do a cool drawing, and want to make prints of it to sell. There's always these questions you have that you don't know that you don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know the question, or you do know the question, but you don't know how to get to that end point. And so that was a lot of the initial, and this is something you've touched on, you and I've talked about when you were up here in Omaha. But sometimes people use that as a reason to not do something. It's just, well, I don't even know how I would do that. So, why do it?
Right.
I wasn't quite to that point. I was just more like, there's a lot of barriers to entry here that I don't have the answers to. And so at some point I'll do it. And I didn't really give myself a date. And then it took a couple of things, personal things happening to me, that I had a pretty catastrophic roof fall accident, that didn't kill me. And then, surprise, I'm a ghost. The phone just falls down.
No wonder John likes you so much.
was exactly. And then I switched companies to the company that I'm at now. And in doing that, there was a lot of, and the company I had been at before, I had been at for a little over almost 12 years.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of new starts with that. And so with that happening, I kind of used that as a launch pad to do some different things. And one of the things I had in my brain was I wanted to start a podcast. And so I just decided that I'm just going to start one. I may not have the answers, but I'm going to, figure this out one step at a time as I go. And, here we are 5 years later, and we have, a whole network, and
and the credit on that really goes to you, Eddie. You have an amazing network of people, but it's also, John and I have talked about this extensively, it's because you're so easy and personable yourself. I mean, there are people who I think gravitate to you. I think you're a magnet for good people. I just do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm a magnet for bad ones too, I'll tell you.
I don't believe you. I don't believe you. I mean,
no. What I will say is, when one of the biggest things that I've learned and that I continue to kind of trust in, if I go out there in the world, just anywhere, and I put my enthusiastic best into what I'm doing, and it doesn't have to be a podcast. It can be your work. It can literally, this is one of those things that, like, all these my wife's a big self-help book podcast listener. She loves this stuff. She loves positive reinforcement. And one of the consistent themes that I've heard repeated and that I've made part of my DNA is, even the things that maybe you're not looking forward to a whole bunch, just fool your brain into enthusiastically putting your best into it. And what happens is that either you find that it's not as unenjoyable as you thought it was going to be, or if it is something that you legitimately believe in, then as you throw your enthusiastic best into it, you're going to inspire and ignite that in the people who you associate with.
I agree. I think I've learned that over the last few months, really, is that your attitude and being positive will make you, or you'll allow it to break you. So I think that's one of the reasons that I've embraced CrossFit so much, is because it has changed the way I think and how I approach things, and just being a happier, healthier person.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. Kind of approaching things in a positive way, whether you think so or not, but tricking that brain, turning on that switch, makes all the difference.
I agree. It's one of those things that it's very easy to have a good attitude when things are going well.
Yes.
And I'm not acting, please do not misread this as me saying, like, this is what I got it down and I figured it out, because my family and my wife will attest, like, I have my ups and downs like anybody else. But more often than not now, I've really made it a part of my brain to just start dismissing those negative inklings that come in, like, this isn't going to work. This is, you've bitten off more than you can chew. You're not good enough. All that stuff. I've decided to start just throwing it off to the wind and just completely start trusting my instincts. And I'm just going to do what I can do. And maybe you may take on a little bit more than you can do. You know what? Life has a nice way of stripping that stuff away sometimes.
You're right.
So at the end of the day, I just, as far as the podcasts go, they bring me joy. They really do. I love the people who we've connected with, who've become friends. Frankly speaking, a podcast family, as far as I'm concerned. And as you grow and learn and do things together, you just get better at it. And as long as people want to keep going, then we'll keep doing them,
And I felt like, especially, when we came up for Ocon, I felt, even though I hadn't even started podcasting, I felt very much I felt very welcome by everyone. And that conversation hanging out Friday night at DJ's was like, wow, there's this whole great community of people that have a lot of the same similar interests as I do. And they're like, I could spend days, if not weeks, talking to them. And I just realized what a great community you've built, but also a community that attracts like-minded people to you. And so I'm very impressed with that. And I'm impressed with your passion for podcasting. What advice would you give to anyone who's been sitting on the fence for a while, wondering, well, should I get into podcasting? How do I do it? What advice would you give them?
My biggest piece of advice, honestly, doesn't lie with the technical. It's easy to get caught up in that, between the type of microphone you use, how you record, how you edit, what service you host through, whether it's Libsyn or Podbean or whatever. It's very easy to get wrapped up in all of that. And there's people who that's what they like to talk about, and I don't begrudge any of that. My big thing is you need to be doing it because you want to do it, because you believe in it. Right now, podcasting, there's a lot of podcasts out there. And it's one of those things that you're doing it because you enjoy it and you believe in what you're doing. You believe in the subject. You're having a good time. I believe if you're having a fun time, and legitimately so, the people listening will have fun with you. And you can't hide your investment in it. And I'm not trying to say that I will say that, I mean, just statistically, there's got to be some shows out there that people look at it as a thing they have to do, or, it's a component, say that they're a public figure. So they're told, hey, you should have a podcast. It's a good thing to add to your repertoire and all that. But what I would say is, if anyone starting a podcast, make sure that what you're talking about is something that you believe in, that you're excited about, and that you enjoy sharing with other people. And then the other piece I would share with people is, make sure you make your audience feel like they are part of what's going on as often as possible. And if you create a community like that, then they're going to follow you a lot more and a lot more consistently than if you, say, recorded a show, and I won't name shows or occurrences, but if you have a show where there's a lot of inside jokes, where the people who are hosting it and a select few watching it know what they're talking about, it's almost like they're speaking in code. And what happens is the people who don't know what's happening feel instantly left out of what's happening, and then are less likely to continue listening, because they're like, I don't even know what they're talking about. It's tempting to do that. And sometimes, not tempting, but sometimes, especially when someone starts early podcasting, you start referencing things that happened within your personal circle, or within that smaller circle, or larger but still small circle of other podcast listeners or viewers, and the larger whole may not know what you're talking about. That was one thing that I had to kind of learn to not do when we first started recording. There was an instance where someone had like, oh, that thing you did last time, ha ha ha, and it was vague enough that the people listening who didn't know the thing that happened last time wouldn't have found it funny, because it just doesn't make there's no context. So it sounds weird, but sometimes you'll record a show where you'll say a thing, and then several shows later you'll begin to reference something you said before, and you'll have to basically kind of give a quick backstory, assuming that the people who are listening may not have heard that. So that's something to bear in mind on that. But other than that, you got to be authentic too. That's one thing that I would definitely, which is kind of a defining part of our generation anyway, I would say. And the generation behind us, as much as some people like to throw millennials crap, I kind of admire them in a way where they are completely authentic, or they strive to be authentic. I'll put it that way. And, or they strive for authenticity as well. So, making sure that your authentic self and a certain amount of authenticity is showing through all the time. Long-winded answer again. Hello. Hello.